Hi, and welcome to Lesson 6 of our 12-lesson e-course or resource guide on how to give your child a classical Christian education at home. And you'll recall that last time we introduced the classical trivium as the basic methodology for a classical education and actually a biblical education, or a biblical methodology. If you'll look up Proverbs 2:6, you're going to find all three of those basic elements of the trivium in one little verse there: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And we're going to postpone the study of grammar for a little bit later in the course. And you'll recall that last time we spent some extra time on the dialectic, logic. And this time we're going to focus more on the rhetoric phase of the trivium. Rhetoric as a foundational life skill. And our lesson objective will be to explain the practical applications of rhetoric in everyday life and how valuable they can be for you and your children. Well, first of all, what do these four incidents have in common? Number one, a candidate for state legislature leans back in his chair at a meeting of the local PTA. Suddenly, the moderator shoots him an icy glare. What do you plan to do about the education funding problem, Mr. Smith? Number two, there he is again, your toughest competitor, smiling at you from the local business news. For the third time in 6 months. Why don't they ever ask me to submit an article, you wonder? I could use the publicity. You overlook the fact that your competitor took the initiative to submit the article at no charge. Number three, a local businessman reads an invitation to deliver the luncheon address at his local Rotary Club. For a moment he is seized by a panic attack and the temptation to be regrettably out of town on the date in question. Number four, for months you have been practically begging for the opportunity to make a presentation to an important potential business client. Now you're at the door and your hands break out in a cold sweat. You feel your throat constricting and a sudden urge to turn around and walk the other way. So what do these four incidents have in common? They are all situations that most of our children will encounter at one time or another in their journey through life. All of them call for skillful use of the art of rhetoric. When their moment arrives, will they be ready? If you're like me, you came up through the public school system and are probably ill-prepared for these kinds of situations. As we have seen, John Dewey's progressive model transformed education away from an emphasis on critical thinking and communication skills needed to develop an integrated view of the world. Instead, knowledge was chopped up into subjects, presented in isolated classes, with the end of each session punctuated by a bell. No longer was the purpose of education to equip children for their unique role as soldiers to advance the kingdom of Christ and the Great Commission. Instead, children were taught to think just like everybody else and respond in instant obedience whenever the bell sounded. This is the model citizen desired by the state, malleable to its purposes, endowed with an idolatrous form of patriotism, and thus ready to sacrifice everything for the wars of the state. To enforce the desired uniformity, it is necessary to separate the child from the sanctuary of his family as early in life as possible, a sanctuary where individuality would be nurtured. This so-called free government school is the ideal vehicle for this choice, or for this purpose. There the child can be taught what to think, not how to think, and communicate his thoughts to others. And so, whatever rhetorical skills we now possess, we've had to learn in the school of hard knocks. Chances are good that our rhetorical armor has more than its share of chinks. But now you hold in your hands the power to make things turn out differently for your children. Skill in rhetoric is the hammer by which your child can break the shackles of the state's hypnotic control of their responses. In summary, here's why the formal study of rhetoric in the classical curriculum is so important in the academic training of your children. 6 points. First, we all enter the world with an ability and need to communicate. The most important steps in rhetorical training were accomplished in the first 2 years of your life when you learned to speak. From speaking, then on to reading and writing, to artistic expression and appreciation, rhetorical situations have surrounded you throughout your life. Second, rhetoric is defined as the study of the communication arts, or as Aristotle puts it, the art of finding the possible means of persuasion in reference to any given situation. But in many ways, rhetoric defies definition, and justly so. If you undertook a study of communication and didn't come away impressed with the subtle shades of interpretation and expression present even in everyday conversation, you would have studied very superficially indeed. Third, when students reach the later years of high school, their thoughts often turn to relationships. From relationships, they naturally incline also to art and poetry and an appreciation of the higher, more subtle forms of communication. Having completed their dialectic training and having solved the greater problems of the world to their own satisfaction, they turn naturally to the environment in which they live, an environment teeming with life. They long to express themselves in the creation of art, music, and poetry, the fine arts. So taking advantage of this natural inclination, the classical method of instruction seizes the later high school years as a perfect time to instruct students in the finer points of rhetoric. Fourth, rhetorical training at this point in a student's education emphasizes the activities of public speaking and writing. Starting from first principles, the components of every communication situation, we build up a grid for understanding communication. This helps the student develop skills and a system that takes his powers of persuasion to the next level. Many students are being taught now a Christian worldview in an increasingly hostile cultural environment. It is therefore imperative that we develop an ability to articulate and to defend the truth that employs all the skills of communication available. Fifth, the worldview presented in the Christian faith has found many of its most influential and lasting forms in the hands of those trained in rhetorical arts. From Augustine and his City of God to Chrysostom, which means in Greek golden-tongued, to John Calvin and Martin Luther during the Protestant Reformation. The great teachers of the faith have been men of rhetoric. And finally, number 6, our time calls for men and women of this stature, men possessing not only integrity, learning, and a right understanding of the world, but also that fearsome and glorious skill in words that our Lord himself exhibited when he left his detractors speechless. Logic and rhetoric. So let's test your understanding. This time with 5 multiple choice questions. Rhetoric involves A, speaking, B, writing, or C, both. 2, classic or basic training in rhetoric occurs when the student is A, a college freshman, B, a baby, or C, a sophomore. 3, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of finding the possible means of A, persuasion, B, expression, C, deception. Number 4, rhetoric is positioned in the trivium, A first, B second, or C third. Number 5, training in rhetoric began A with the Reformation, B with the ancient Greeks, or C with Augustine. So let's take them one at a time. Rhetoric involves C. Let me read all 3. Rhetoric involves speaking, B, writing, or C, both. And the answer is C, both. Number 2, basic training in rhetoric occurs when the student is A, a college freshman, B, a baby, or C, a sophomore, and the answer is B, a baby. Number 3, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of finding the possible means of persuasion. That's A. B, expression, or C, deception. And the answer is A, persuasion. Number 4, rhetoric is positioned in the trivium. A first, B second, C third. The answer is C third. And in number 5, training in rhetoric began A with the Reformation, B with the ancient Greeks, C with Augustine. And the answer is B with the ancient Greeks. So for more information about rhetoric, the last stage of the classical trivium, it's indeed its capstone, says Peter Royce, author of The Power of Persuasion. Royce believes that the whole story of redemption itself is centered on revelation and communion on rhetoric. While we're on the subject, I'd like to recommend The Power of Persuasion to you as the first book of its kind. It's a book that makes the ancient theory of rhetoric accessible and practical for the modern reader. There's simply nothing else like it out there. If you want to equip your child to be ready for the kinds of real-life situations that I outlined at the beginning of this article, you can't afford to be without this book. Quote, the assignments in this book are not the dry, boring homework that many people would expect from a subject with a name like rhetoric, but rather contain exercises ranging from reading St. Augustine's On Christian Doctrine to the hilarious works of Mark Twain. The Power of Persuasion is the book that will bring rhetoric to life for your students. And that was a quote from Raz Schaefer, who was a rhetoric student of Mr. Royce. So you'll find this book as well in the bookstore at kingswayclassicalacademy.com. Now, formal rhetoric training in the later years of high school is only the foundation, and the foundations are very important for supporting all the work that comes after. No one rejoices when they have laid the foundation, but rather when they complete the building. Then they rejoice. They look at the finished product. Then they go forth and enjoy the fruit of their labors. So the practice of rhetoric is the culmination of the classical trivium. It's a lifelong endeavor, really. Whether a student uses his training in the later years to strike down error and demonstrate Christ's lordship in the workplace, or whether he uses his rhetorical training to winsomely present the stories of the kingdom to covenant children, a rhetorical training is truly a gift that keeps on giving. So this completes our overview of the trivium-based method of the classical approach. And we're going to return to that grammar stage later in the course, as I said earlier. But next time we're going to examine the content of a classical Christian education. So until then, we'll see you for the next lesson, Lord willing.